The battle for the 2023 Supercars Championship continues to tighten after a set of 3 races up in the Northern Territory that saw plenty of heat both on and off the track. We saw another Gen 3 fire, some underdog victories, and a war of words that has carried on since the moment the checkered flag fell on Sunday. As usual, I'm here to discuss it all as part of my Round 5 preview here on Fan at the Fence. We'll kick things off with a recap of how each of the races unfolded, starting off with race 1 of the weekend held on the Saturday, which had Brock Feeney and Cameron Waters on the front row, but all eyes soon turned to Mark Winterbottom as he actually got past Feeney for second place in the first turn and immediately started putting the pressure on Cameron Waters for the win. That battle was brewing really nicely, but just a few laps into the race, Cameron Waters retired with a major fire under the bonnet of his Mustang. Another fuel fire, this time for a different reason to what we saw in Melbourne, and I'll discuss that more a bit later, but it did some serious damage to that car and he was lucky to get out of that without any injuries. Elsewhere, we saw a very physical race with drivers making lots of contact as they jockeyed for position. Fortunately, nothing too major in terms of accidents, but there was plenty of panel beating going on that Saturday night. All attention though was on Frosty at the drop of the flag. Mark Winterbottom taking his first Supercars victory in 7 years and doing it in style as well, holding off a fast charging Brock Feeney at the end. So that was our podium for race 1. Mark Winterbottom, Brock Feeney and Will Davidson picking up a long overdue podium for Shell in third. Moving into Sunday, Brock Feeney and Andre Heimgartner were leading the way for race 2. Andre Heimgartner actually having to hold off a very fast starting SVG during the opening laps. Further back we had a lot of mid-pack congestion, but overall it was a much tamer race compared to the Saturday. And in terms of other notable people down the pack, Erebus didn't have the greatest weekend, but they were still consolidating their positions in the top 10 in this race. And the other standout for me was Macaulay Jones finishing in P7 during this race. Certainly the best result I've seen him have for a while. But at the front it was a flawless drive for Red Bull and specifically Brock Feeney, who put in a pretty dominant performance. So it was a Red Bull 1-2, Brock Feeney taking the win, SVG in second, and Andre Heimgartner doing well up there in third, but I'm sure he's getting frustrated that he hasn't quite got that top step yet. The final race of the weekend saw Jack LeBrock for Truck Assist Racing out of all people lead the pack away after a fantastic qualifying session, but further back in the pack we saw big championship news as Brody Kostecki took steering damage at turn 6 and was brought into the pit lane, dropping a few laps, finishing the race but losing a lot of potential points. We saw another clumsy collision later in the race at turn 6 between Jack Smith and Matt Payne. We'll get into that one during Clash Chat, but at the front it was an MSR masterclass. Jack LeBrock taking his second win in Supercars and I believe the first win for MSR Racing as a team. So yes, it was a happy podium with Jack LeBrock at the top, Andre Heimgartner once again finishing off the weekend with a strong performance, and Brock Feeney also doing a very solid job getting another podium in third. So how did the weekend's action stack up against my pre-Darwin predictions? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. My first prediction was that Ford would get their first on-track victory of the year, and that was looking real strong at the start of Saturday's race, but soon and literally went up in flames. So it's an X on that one. My second prediction was that Erebus would have a slump by their very high standards this year. That one did come true. Those guys did not get a podium all weekend, but did reasonably well to consolidate, apart from Kostecki's incident on the Sunday. And my final prediction unfortunately did come true, which is that we saw another Gen 3 fire. Now, I should say, coming into this weekend, when I made this prediction, I was thinking it's Darwin, the cars are reasonably new, we're probably going to find the heat limit of a new part this weekend, but I was thinking, you know, something like a minor brake fire or a bit of bodywork catching a light. I wasn't thinking anywhere near as major as what we saw for Cameron Waters. So I'm looking at this right now, wishing I could swap the cross on the top and the tick on the bottom, but unfortunately we did see some carnage, and that brings us to the Carnage report. So as I said, the racing was very physical this weekend, meaning there is more damage than I could possibly cover in a single round review, but I picked out a few of the key incidents. Practice and qualifying were pretty much clean on the damage front, but that soon changed in the races. I mentioned earlier Cameron Waters had that big fuel fire, and despite looking looking incredibly similar to what we saw in Melbourne. It was actually due to a different reason, with a fuel fitting failing, and I felt really sorry for Cameron Waters because I felt like this car lit up at the worst possible moment. He had just passed the pit lane and he had to trundle all the way around through turn 1 to get to a fire marshal and stop in a safe spot. I feel like had that happened anywhere else, they may have been able to put that fire out a little bit quicker, but he was just really unlucky with the timing on that one. James Courtney nearly gave Tickford some more repair work as he spun at the final corner, having a glancing blow with the concrete wall next to the drag strip, fortunately able to get away with that one. And on the topic of good fortune, we were very lucky not to have more cars damaged at the restart of race 1 as the field really stacked up, and we're lucky to avoid a major accident that could have taken multiple cars out of contention. Race 2 did see something of a group accident with Matt Payne, Declan Fraser, Jack Smith and Jack LeBrock all get entangled up going into turn 7. That saw big damage to the back of Jack LeBrock's car, and the team actually had to thrash to get that thing repaired for the third and final race, and it's a good thing they did considering they ended up winning the thing. Then the third and final race did see that big damage for Brody Costecchio. I never actually worked out who he had that contact with. It was just that usual mid-pack congestion, but that saw big implications for his championship, and of course a really weird collision between Matt Payne and Jack Smith on the exit or going through turn 6. And that brings us to Clash Chat. We didn't have too many sort of high profile incidents this weekend or any major controversy between the cars on track, but this one was just so comical to watch that I had to talk about it. So this one unfolded with Matt Payne at the back of a 4-car battle group with Jack Smith immediately in front of him. The two vehicles at the front took a much slower entry into turn 6 than I think anyone expected, and Jack Smith opened the door down the inside. Matt Payne threw it down there in a bit of a desperate lunge. Unfortunately, didn't get up quite far enough in my opinion and spun Jack Smith out. But that wasn't the end of it. Going a very slow speed, Smith actually then whacked into the rear wheels of Matt Payne and also spun him out. Now, it all looked a little bit comical, but we could have seen a pretty major accident here as Chaz Mostert came flying around that corner just moments later, so I'm very glad all the cars stopped where they did. Matt Payne got a 5-second penalty for this incident from race control, and I think that was about right. You know, you've got to go for the moves when the opportunity's open, but unfortunately this one just didn't quite pay off. So what were the key positives and key takeaways from the weekend for me? Well, firstly, I feel like the racing intensity really lifted in Darwin. At the start of the year, it felt like the drivers were being really cautious with their new machines, and who can blame them with the rumoured price tags on them, but it felt like the new car smell wore off up in Darwin and they weren't afraid to get physical. Of course, I never want to see massive damage to vehicles, but a bit of rubbing as racing is definitely what I wanted to see from Gen 3, and it felt like there was a lot more of that this weekend. My second key positive is that the cars handled the heat a lot better than I expected. I expected a lot more driver complaints about the cabin conditions. I didn't see too much on that front, so that's a big improvement over the complaints seen in Newcastle. And then the cars actually raced pretty well considering the temperatures. We've seen issues with engines getting hot and the front tires overheating, and I'm sure there was plenty of that going on, but it didn't seem to detract too much from the on-track action. We saw loads of good battles in all 3 races. My third key positive is that the Underdog started delivering on their promise. In my Tassie review, I mentioned that they were showing signs of promise, but this time they brought home the bacon with 2 Underdog victories for Mark Winterbottom and Jack LeBrock, which I think is a big tick for Gen 3, seeing those smaller teams fight it at the front. And then finally, we had 3 different winners from the 3 different races, and the championship picture overall has continued to tighten, which bodes well for the second half of the season. You guys know me by now, I like to balance the good with the bad, and the only weekend woe that I can really focus on leaving Darwin is the elephant in the room, and that is of course the huge boil over about parity. Now, parity is a complex topic that I have some equally complex thoughts on, so I'll save those thoughts for a dedicated sort of mid-season Gen 3 review video that I'll bring you guys before Townsville. But the thing I want to focus on here is that it's just put a bit of a shadow over the Darwin weekend, and I think that's a big shame that it was allowed to get to this point where rather than it be something that was gradually chipped away at, it's just sort of all exploded, this parity argument over Darwin, because we had some great stories. In my opinion, we had some pretty solid on-track racing. We had 3 different winners from 3 different races, and we had 2 underdogs get victories as well, and instead of the headlines being about those fantastic human stories that have a real personal touch, it's all about the technical state of the sport. And of course it's important to cover, but as I said, it's just a bit of a shame it got to this really big boiling point and that it wasn't sort of dealt with in increments as the seasons carried on and the evidence has started stacking up. Now, as of recording, Supercars have actually made a statement saying that a clause in the regulations has been triggered, so they are going to reassess the current state of the cars and make sure they're equal, and of course if they do find an issue, make some adjustments. Now, regardless of where you stand on the parity situation right now, I'm of the belief that no stone should ever be left unturned on this front. Parity is just a pillar of the sport. It has to be correct in order for the sport to be the best it can be. So I'm really reassured by this. As I said, it's a shame it's taken to get to this sort of point where there are just such major frustrations among the paddock, but hopefully any issues can be found and fixed, and we can hopefully in the future focus purely on some amazing on-track action with some good close battles between the two brands. Okay, let's cheer things up by handing out some awards, a new segment of the show that I'm introducing. I'm still playing around with the names of these categories, but I've got a solid starting point. So let's start with the surprise of the weekend, and I'm going to give this to two people. Number one, Bryce Forward for a really strong Saturday. I feel like home races for supercar drivers rarely go well, but Forward sort of bucked that trend with a good performance, almost getting on the podium on Saturday. And Zane Goddard also stood out to me. He didn't have any sort of spellbounding performances, but I think he did really well considering he hasn't had too much time in a Gen 3 supercar and certainly not in wheel-to-wheel combat. He made a small mistake on the Sunday, nearly found himself in the wall, but overall I was pretty impressed with how he carried himself. Alright, next up is what I'm calling the V7 award. Who was running on 7 cylinders this weekend, not quite on full form? I'm going to give this one once again to two drivers, Matt Payne and Declan Fraser. It felt like every time these two guys were on screen they were in some sort of kerfuffle on the racetrack, and unfortunately just a bit of a rough weekend all round for those guys across the 3 races. My next award is Who Gave It to Jandor, and I'm going to give this to Chaz Mostert for basically overtaking half the field 3 times over. He had some horrific qualifying sessions, and you just can't help but wonder how far he would have been up the field had he had some better starting positions. But nevertheless, it was fun to see his name climb up the leaderboard on the left hand side. And my final award, the special shout out, this just has to go to Tickford Racing for their amazing rebuild of Cameron Waters' car. I thought that thing was quite literally toast when I saw it after the incident on Saturday, but they worked all the way to 3:30 AM on the Sunday. It sounds like they also got good help from some of their fellow teams, which was good to hear, and they were able to get that car back on the racetrack. A really amazing effort from them. Overall, I'm going to give this weekend 3 out of 5 stars. Now, if I'm honest, the on-track action probably warrants 4 out of 5 stars, especially when we had 3 different winners from the 3 different races. But unfortunately, just that sort of big cloud around parity and the fact that has dominated the headlines since the weekend, unfortunately it's just left a sour taste in my mouth, so I've ducked a star off. But as I said, the on-track product, minus all that background stuff, was actually quite exciting this weekend. You guys opted a bit more on the positive side than me. The majority of people, 50% that voted, went for 4 stars, the next biggest group 3 stars, so I think overall it was an above average weekend in terms of entertainment for most people. Finishing up with some final thoughts from you guys, I had to include this one here from Dan despite having to redact some of the language. He deducted 2 stars from his rating due to an issue with SuperView, which he uses to watch supercars, and I felt really sorry for him, especially because he's a huge Frosty fan and he missed out on seeing Frosty win live as a result. Now, I watch motorsport through KO and Stan Sport as well for some series, and I get so frustrated when any issues happen with the stream, so I cannot imagine how painful it must have been when your favorite driver actually won the race where the stream failed. So hard out to you, Dan. Hopefully that's the last technical issue you have for the rest of the year. Carl Hawkins said a few things here, but the one I want to point out is that the championship continues to close, and I think that's probably a bit of an underlying storyline from this weekend. We saw a lot of strong performances. I think Red Bull maybe have started to turn a corner as well after their recent tests, so I think we might look back on this Darwin weekend as a bit of a pivotal point in the championship where momentum might drop for some teams but build for others, but nevertheless we will see as the coming rounds approach. Then finally, Curry Pie had a few thoughts here, but the one I wanted to point out was that qualifying was a bit weird on the Sunday with Waters and Mostert and Frosty quite far down at the bottom. But I wanted to bring this up because I feel like qualifying has also been a bit of an understated story this year, where we're seeing a lot of variation in qualifying. You know, some people have terrible sessions and then a blinder the next on, you know, on the same track, just minutes apart. So the qualifying is really interesting. I think that might sort of signal just how knife edge the cars are to drive, and I think that's good because we do see some variance in the grids. We pretty much have a largely mixed up grid at the start of every race, which is really good to see, and I'm enjoying watching the drivers sort of try and make up for lost ground during qualifying during the races as well. So yeah, I think that was a good shout calling out qualifying. On to the championship standings. As we've alluded to, things continue to close up. Brody Kostecki still leads the way despite his pretty treacherous race on the Sunday, taking steering damage. Will Brown has closed up nice and close in second place, but it's Brock Feeney who I think is really starting to emerge as a potential dark horse for this championship, not too far away. His teammate is hot on his heels as well, and despite having those poor qualifying, Chaz Mostert is also doing quite well up there in fifth still. The only other person I really want to shout out here is Jack LeBrock. Obviously he's got lots of headlines after taking a victory this weekend, but he's had a pretty solid overall season so far, and he is up there in 8th. So it'll be interesting to see if some of these underdog teams can continue to put on a bit of a late championship charge. Potentially not for the win, but it will be good to see them quite close to those top teams. On the team side of things, Erebus continued to lead the way with Red Bull hot on their heels. Brad Jones Racing is in 3rd, Walkinshaw Andretti United in 4th, and Shell V-Power Racing are 1 point ahead of Tickford, who, again, they must be thinking what must have or what could have been after multiple issues with some of their cars throughout the season. If I'm being completely honest, I didn't get to watch any of the support category action because I had family commitments on all 3 days, but the one thing I did get to watch outside of Supercars was the drag racing on the Saturday night, and I wanted to bring this up because it was a fantastic show overall, but we saw a horrendous accident for top Doorslammer driver Kelvin Lyle, who I've watched over many years race here at the Perth Motorplex in Western Australia. So just want to give a big shout out to him. Hopefully he recovers well. It was a terrifying accident to watch live, and fingers crossed he's back on his feet soon. But that will bring my Darwin review to an end. Attention now turns to the Townsville 500 on the 7th to the 9th of July. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see my round preview for that event, but I suspect we're going to have plenty of Supercars news to keep us busy in the meantime. Until then, treat people like your trackside down there in the comments, especially with this P word flying around so much, and I will see you in the next one.